Anything yet?
Nope. Just walking around like robots.
Well, I guess we better go on and brief them anyway.
Yeah.
Just in case. Day 37. Still no signs of anything important. And still no signs of any evidence that these people are in fact spies. Which either makes them really good or makes us really bad.
Yep, or really bored. One of those.
All we know is that in the next 20 to 30 minutes, there's going to be an information drop between our two suspects. The only reason we know that is because of a reliable source that is still giving us hope that these people are, in fact, who we have heard that they are. We have a man who's going to be tailing them, surveilling them, just to make sure that the information that we've gotten is real, that it's sound, and that we actually have something to go on.
And yes, we are being very careful under the assumption that they are legit and they do have information that we do not want falling into the wrong hands.
We will report any information as soon as it becomes available, and we will make sure to keep to the highest levels of ethics and follow protocol as closely to the letter as we can. Surveillance out.
And the boredom sets in.
And the boring sets in. But do you know, really, it's not as so bad. We could be dead.
We could. But, like, why are we here, though? Like,
gosh. That is a question that has been asked many, many times. And I think over the course of history, people have forgotten why spies in America have been important. Do you know how it all got started?
how what got started?
What we're doing.
Spying?
Spying. In America.
Yes, I know. Nathan Hale, Culper Ring. 1755. Yeah, I know the little shebang.
You know a little bit of it, but let's talk more about it.
Do we have to?
Yeah, we have to. Oh, don't be so glum about it. It could be worse. We could have stuff we have to do.
I would long for something like that right now.
Well, we don't have anything right now, so might as well just listen. So, you said 1755 about Nathan Hale. Yeah, you're right. He was born in 1755 in Tolland County, Connecticut. You know what? He was educated by a local minister from a very early age. And in 1769, he was so good at his education that he entered Yale University. He graduated in 1773 and became a teacher. And he taught throughout New England, and while he was living in New London, he found out about the attacks on Lexington and Concord. And when that happened, he gave a really passionate town hall speech, stirred the people up about patriotism and independence, and he joined the ranks of the Continental Army in 1775. And he was actually promoted to the rank of captain in January of 1776, and was selected to lead a group of men called Knowlton's Rangers, which was actually a division of soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton. And at the time of his promotion, British forces had actually captured New York, and any attempt to infiltrate their camp was unsuccessful. And unable to determine their strengths or numbers, General George Washington, called on Knowles to find a volunteer to infiltrate their ranks without notice. And because intelligence gathering was still in infancy in the colonies, people thought spies were dishonorable and were cowardly because of what they did.
Even though it was in its infancy, it sounds a lot more interesting than what we're doing right now.
Maybe Hale saw that because he volunteered, and when a close friend asked him why he was doing it and tried to convince him not to go, Hale said, "I wish to be useful. Every kind of service that is necessary to the public good becomes honorable by being necessary." And actually, what he did as a spy worked out really well for what he did as a school teacher. You know, he became a Dutch school teacher behind enemy lines, and he was really good at it too, or so we think. He was scheduled to leave on September the 12th, and then was supposed to arrive back within 2 weeks. But on the 21st, he was captured by the British and brought before General William Howe. And Howe quickly determined that he was in possession of knowledge of their troops.
So it sounds like he was a really sucky spy.
Well, he gave up his true identity and his purpose for being behind their lines, and was sentenced to be executed the next day. Okay, so he wasn't the best example of effective spying, but Washington and the other generals could have trashed the idea of intelligence gathering at that point and decided to move on to something else, but they didn't. And they needed people to infiltrate and dismantle British forces without them even realizing what was going on. And so it was important that when they picked these people, they needed people who were already in a position to be able to effectively spy, who were already established within the community of New York, who could fit in. And in order to do that, they needed someone who was going to lead the selection and the overseeing of these spies. That's where George Washington comes in. Washington already had success in using intelligence gathering because he used it during the French and Indian War, actually for the British. That's where he learned a lot of his methods of encryption and protecting information and using things like ciphers in order to get information from behind enemy lines. And he would misinform French spies, he would recruit and manage spies for the British, and because of this, he was the prime candidate for setting up a system in New York. But he couldn't do it alone. He enlisted Major Benjamin Talmadge, who was his second in command, to establish a network of spies in New York City that would report their findings directly back to Washington. And in 1778, the operation started. They named the operation Samuel Culper. Samuel was the front name for the whole operation, and in order for the operation to be a total thing, Talmadge needed some major players.
Who was involved with that?
Well, he first turned to a guy named Abram Woodall, who was actually a friend from Setauket, Long Island, to help. And Woodall was important because he enlisted the first of many of the spies. He enlisted Robert Townsend. And that name's going to be important because Townsend was probably one of the most strategic spies they had. He held a society reporting job for the New York World Gazette, which was a very loyalist, pro-British newspaper. And he also owned a dry goods store in Manhattan. And because he spent a lot of time in the shipyards looking at inventory, he was able to get a lot of information through other spies that would come through the ring back to Talmadge in Washington. He was given the nickname Culper Jr., and it was through him that the network of spies and the chain of intelligence gathering really began. So you're probably asking yourself, how did it all happen? What was the typical information transfer like? Let me tell you how it went down. Townsend would find out what he could and write his information on invisible ink, and a local tavern owner named Austin Rowe would visit the store, and under the pretense of buying supplies for that place, would sign an order from Talmadge under the code name John Bolton. In this message, there were prearranged code words from General Washington to Talmadge, and Talmadge would respond in the same way, in code. The messages were hidden in the goods that Rowe bought, and he would ride 55 miles by horseback to give it to Abram Woodall.
That sounds about as monotonous as what we're doing today.
But a little bit more exciting, because what would happen after Woodhull got the information would be that a farmer who lived near Woodhull, her name was Anna Strong, would hang petticoats from her clothesline, specifically a black petticoat, signaling to a fellow spy, whose name was Caleb Brewster, that he needed to come retrieve documents that were to go through the ring. Brewster would take the information, he would go to Fairfield, Connecticut, which was along the river, and it would be couried from there to Talmadge, who would in turn give it to Washington. It took about a week to get all of this stuff done, but that length of time was such a small price to pay for helping avoid British forces that patrolled the river. The information would help Washington find out troop movements and key tactics that he would need to implement in order to counteract what was going on within the British forces. And they actually also used women and children to ferry the information from person to person because it was easier for them, people that society didn't necessarily look at as important or as worth having anything to say. They used them to gather and report information. Their tactics and methods were good, very good. They escaped detection numerous times. But the real test for the Culper Ring came when they received some of the most important information that they had had to date. See, the British were planning on raiding Newport, Rhode Island on a day when they received word that French troops would be landing to aid the Continental Army. When they relayed the news to Washington, when they found out, the Culper Ring got it all the way through, and Washington decided to put a plan into action. He moved troops towards New York City in order to fake an attack. And by doing so, he hoped that the British would stay in New York to defend themselves. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. And by feigning an attack and causing the British to stay, they allowed French troops to get onto American soil unharmed so that they could help the Continental Army fight their last of the battles. Without the Culper Ring and their interference through all of that, the French probably never would have made it to American shores safely. But it would be really, really dishonorable of me to them if I didn't tell you about their greatest achievement.
What was that?
The discovery of a turncoat. Benedict Arnold, as it were. Every story needs a villain, and this has the worst villain imaginable. A betrayer, someone who goes against everything that they've stood for in the beginning. And that was Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold was he was a warrior. He was on his way to becoming someone that would be idolized by the American people. From key victories and roles in the Battle of St. John's, Quebec, he was a brilliant tactician. He was a skilled leader, and in spite of his tendencies towards tempestuousness and a mood that could change in the blink of an eye, his victories helped him to rise to the ranks, but he was never given seniority. And many, many times he vowed that he would leave the Continental Army. But George Washington, who at the time was a close friend of his, convinced him to stay and stay and stay. He led a heroic rally of fleeing troops at the Battle of Bemis Heights while suffering from a leg injury that would actually stay with him for the rest of his life. And when he did that, Congress actually finally gave him his seniority and actually gave him a command over a garrison in Philadelphia at the same time. But his tendencies towards anger didn't help, and he continued to make enemies, and actually found himself under congressional investigation for financial impropriety in 1778. That's when Benedict decided to change his colors. And when the British heard about that, they made quick plans to seize the moment. And that's where John Andre comes into the picture. John Andre was the intelligence commander of the British forces. And he began to communicate with Arnold, who, after negotiations, agreed to hand over West Point, where he was commander, as well as other military bases, for a large sum. But something happened that kept the tides from turning. Andre was detained after the meeting by an American officer who just was a routine stop. He didn't know anything about what was going on. And he was sent back to West Point to be questioned by Arnold. So what would have happened was that John Andre would have gotten off scot-free. Talmadge heard about the detainment, and he had an intricate knowledge, so much so, of the spy ring network that was going on in New York, that when he found out that Andre was meeting with Arnold, and he knew about the problems that Arnold was having, he wondered if Arnold had anything to do with what was going on. And so he sent troops to capture Andre on his way back, and it was discovered that he was carrying information about military strongholds in his boot. He was arrested and convicted of espionage and executed. And no one really knows what happened to give him proof of Andre's actions, because as Talmadge himself put it, he deliberately concluded to never disclose the circumstances relating to that interesting event. But it is safe to assume that the Culper Ring played a huge part in that. That being their greatest achievement, that no one could ever really prove that they did anything. It was only through the letters of Talmadge and Washington that we really know so much about them. Arnold fled the country after he heard that Andre had died, and he carried out a brief career as a brigadier general for the British Navy, but his past as a turncoat caught up with him, and he died mistrusted, penniless, and without a country to call home.
Sounds like a fitting end.
Which is actually kind of how our story ends as well, because after that, after the decline of Arnold and the execution of Andre, the tide of the war really changed. And the Americans were able to win, the British surrendered, and the Culper Ring, undetected, were able to slip into the ranks of history. But without the Culper Ring, it really isn't hard to imagine a very different outcome of that war. The French would have never been able to land, and we would never have known the outcomes of what would have happened because of that. And key victories might have never even happened. And the kind of intelligence gathering that we do today, like what we're doing right now, may never even have happened.
I know more now.
What are the odds that they're actually spies?
What?
The people we're watching, what are the odds that they're actually spies?